In the summer of 1899, Nikola Tesla sat alone in a Colorado Springs laboratory, surrounded by equipment that crackled with electricity and hummed with voltage high enough to kill a man in seconds. He was listening to the universe, and the universe, impossibly, seemed to be listening back. Through his primitive receivers, designed to detect lightning storms hundreds of miles away, Tesla heard something that made his blood run cold. A rhythmic pattern of electrical pulses that appeared to follow his own transmissions. Not random static, not atmospheric noise, something that behaved like a response. Tesla was no fool. He understood the chaos of natural phenomena, the way lightning storms roared and faded, the crackling randomness of electromagnetic interference. But this was different. This signal had structure. It had what Tesla believed was intention, and it appeared to answer whenever he transmitted his own experimental pulses into the atmosphere, as if something, somewhere, was acknowledging his presence. He wrote in his journal that night, with a hand that seemed almost reluctant to form the words, "The feeling is constantly growing on me that I had been the first to hear the greeting of one planet to another." He never said aliens. He never used the word extraterrestrial. What he claimed was far more unsettling. He claimed the signal displayed purpose, intelligence. And in 1899, when humanity had barely mastered flight, when radio itself was still a newborn technology, the idea that we might already be under observation was not thrilling, it was terrifying. Tesla's colleagues dismissed him. The scientific establishment mocked him. They suggested interference from distant radio experimenters, atmospheric anomalies, equipment malfunction. But Tesla had spent years perfecting his apparatus. He knew his instruments, he knew the difference between noise and signal, and he knew what repetition meant in the language of communication. Random events don't repeat on cue. Random events don't respond to human transmission. Random events don't pause, wait, and answer back. The signals continued for weeks, always rhythmic, always appearing after his transmissions, always carrying that same eerie pattern like a heartbeat from the void. And then, as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the mystery itself, because now Tesla was left with a question that would haunt him until his death. Had something been listening to humanity's first tentative steps into the electromagnetic spectrum? Had we announced ourselves to the cosmos before we were ready? Or had Tesla simply been the first man to listen too carefully, to hear patterns in the static because the alternative, infinite, crushing silence, was too much for the human mind to bear? What Tesla discovered in that Colorado laboratory wasn't proof of alien life. It was something far more dangerous, the realization that once you start listening for an answer, your mind will find one, whether it exists or not. He had opened a door that could never fully close, and in the century that followed, others would walk through it, each carrying their own piece of a puzzle that might not have any solution at all. The signal from 1899 was just the beginning. On February 11, 1960, a radar station in Grumman Aircraft's Long Island facility detected something that shouldn't have existed. An object was orbiting Earth in a polar trajectory, north to south, crossing both poles, at a time when such orbits were rare, experimental, and deeply alarming. The Pentagon was notified within hours. This wasn't on any known registry. And in the frozen paranoia of the Cold War, unknown meant enemy. The U.S. Navy quickly dispatched teams to visually confirm what the radar was showing. And they saw it, a dark, tumbling object moving in an orbit that seemed beyond what either superpower had publicly demonstrated. The Department of Defense publicly announced the detection, then almost immediately retracted it, offering a flimsy explanation about a recovered fragment from Discoverer 8, a satellite that had been lost months earlier. But the trajectories didn't match. The orbital mechanics were wrong, and the people who tracked satellites for a living knew it. The press began calling it the dark satellite. Not alien, not yet, just dark, unknown, unidentified, uncomfortably silent. In the frozen paranoia of the Cold War, silence was the most terrifying signal of all. Because if your enemy had achieved polar orbit capability before you, if they'd positioned a reconnaissance platform that could photograph every inch of your territory on every pass, you weren't just behind, you were exposed, vulnerable, watched. But here's what made the 1960 detection truly haunting. Official confirmation never came from either side. The Americans said it wasn't theirs, the Soviets offered no acknowledgement at all, which left a question that burned in the minds of military analysts and government officials on both sides of the Iron Curtain. If we didn't put it there and they won't claim it, then what are we looking at? The object was tracked for weeks. Sometimes it appeared on radar, sometimes it vanished. Its behavior defied expectations, orbits that seemed to decay, then stabilize, following no predictable pattern anyone understood at the time. Amateur astronomers reported visual sightings, a dark shape moving against the stars, visible just before dawn or just after dusk, when the angle of sunlight caught it at precisely the right moment. And then, like Tesla's signal 61 years earlier, it simply disappeared from tracking systems. No clear re-entry signature, no confirmed debris field, just gone. What the military wouldn't publicly acknowledge was far more disturbing than what they said. In 1960, humanity had launched fewer than 24 objects into space, and we could account for every single one of them. We knew where they were, we knew their orbits, we knew when they'd fall. This object fit none of our records. It appeared to predate our presence in space, or it operated by rules we hadn't written yet. The Cold War taught us not knowing was worse than any truth. And in 1960, we learned something else. Sometimes the enemy isn't the other superpower. Sometimes it's the growing suspicion that we are all being observed by something that was here first. The question was no longer if something was watching, it was how long had it been there. In 1973, a Scottish astronomer named Duncan Lunan made a discovery that should have been impossible. He wasn't searching for aliens. He wasn't chasing UFOs. He was studying something far stranger, echoes that arrived too late. Radio signals transmitted from Earth into space were bouncing back seconds, sometimes minutes after they should have. These long-delayed echoes, or LDEs, had puzzled scientists since the 1920s, defying every conventional explanation. Lunan decided to do something no one had attempted before. He plotted them as coordinates, and what emerged from the data made his hands shake. The delayed echo patterns, when graphed according to their sequence and timing, formed what looked like a star map, not a random scatter of points, not atmospheric noise translated into meaningless dots, a pattern that pointed to Epsilon Boötes, a star system 203 light-years from Earth. And embedded within the correlation was something that looked disturbingly like a message, a depiction of how that star system appeared 13,000 years ago, when the last ice age still gripped our planet, when human civilization consisted of scattered hunter-gatherers who had not yet discovered agriculture. Lunan published his findings in Spaceflight magazine, fully aware of how insane it sounded. He proposed, cautiously, methodically, that the LDEs might be an automated probe positioned near Earth, reflecting our signals back to us with intentional delays, a breadcrumb trail designed to lead us to a specific point in space and time. The correlations were compelling. The star positions matched Epsilon Boötes as it would have appeared from Earth 13,000 years ago, accounting for stellar drift, precession, and galactic rotation. The pattern was there, not definitive, but compelling enough to refuse easy dismissal. But patterns don't speak, and that was the razor's edge Lunan found himself walking. Because while the correlation was real, provable, repeatable, The interpretation required a leap that science couldn't make. It required believing that something had been waiting in orbit around our planet for 130 centuries, patiently bouncing our radio waves back at us with carefully timed delays, hoping we'd eventually become sophisticated enough to recognize the pattern. It required accepting that we'd been watched since before we built the pyramids, before we invented writing, before we even knew stars were other suns. The scientific community reacted exactly as expected. Some called Lunan's work brilliant pattern recognition. Others called it pareidolia, the human tendency to see meaningful shapes in random data, faces in clouds, messages in static. Lunan himself later revised his interpretation, acknowledging possible errors in his initial methodology, but he never fully retracted the core finding. The echoes existed, the delays were real, and when plotted, they formed a pattern that pointed to Epsilon Boötes as it appeared 13,000 years ago. What haunted Lunan wasn't the criticism, it was the question he couldn't answer. If this was a message, why make it so difficult to decode? Why wait until 1973 to let us find it? Or had it always been there, screaming in mathematics, waiting for humanity to finally learn the language? The map was real. Whether it led anywhere was another matter entirely. But someone or something had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure we'd eventually ask the question. On December 11, 1998, the Space Shuttle Endeavour crew transmitted an image back to Earth that would become the most controversial photograph in the history of space exploration. During mission STS-88, while deploying components of the International Space Station, an astronaut captured something through the shuttle window, a dark, irregular object tumbling slowly against the black void of space. It wasn't on any manifest, it wasn't supposed to be there, and it looked ancient. The image spread across the infant internet like wildfire. Here, finally, was visual proof of what decades of whispers and radar blips had suggested. The object appeared cylindrical, asymmetrical, encrusted with what looked like irregular protrusions or technological components. It moved with a strange, deliberate tumble, as if rotating on an axis that defied simple physics. Amateur analysts zoomed in, enhanced the pixels, circulated the image through early conspiracy forums and email chains. This was it, the dark satellite, the Watcher, the 13,000-year-old probe the Duncan Lunan star map had predicted, the thing that had appeared on radar in 1960, the listener that had responded to Tesla in 1899. The timing felt prophetic, as humanity stood on the threshold of permanent space habitation, as we prepared to maintain a continuous presence beyond Earth's atmosphere. The object revealed itself, as if it had been waiting, as if our reaching this milestone had triggered some predetermined protocol. The photograph became proof, evidence, validation for everyone who had been dismissed as paranoid or delusional. Look, they said, look what's been watching us. NASA's explanation arrived within days, clinical and dismissive. The object was a thermal blanket lost during an earlier EVA, a piece of mundane debris, reflective insulation torn loose during station assembly, just trash. Human garbage floating in orbit, catching sunlight at an angle that made it look mysterious. They even provided tracking data showing the debris field, the trajectory, the estimated mass. Everything matched a lost thermal blanket perfectly. But here's what made the 1998 image so powerful. It didn't matter what NASA said. The belief had already calcified. For people who needed the Black Knight satellite to be real, no explanation would ever be sufficient. NASA had lied before. Governments concealed truth as policy. And this image, this dark, tumbling shape against infinite space, looked nothing like a blanket. It looked like exactly what decades of mythology had promised it would be. The object wasn't ancient, but the need to believe in it was. That photograph became a mirror, reflecting back what each viewer desperately wanted to see. Scientists saw debris, believers saw confirmation, and neither side could convince the other because they weren't looking at the same thing anymore. They were looking at the same pixels, but seeing completely different realities. The thermal blanket burned up in Earth's atmosphere sometime in early 2000, officially removed from tracking databases, cataloged as mission-related debris, and forgotten by everyone except those who refused to forget. Because some stories survive evidence, some mysteries outlive their solutions, and sometimes the most terrifying truth is that we'd rather believe we're being watched than accept that we might be utterly, cosmically alone. The Black Knight satellite was never real, but that's not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a far more unsettling question. Why did we need it to be? Tesla heard patterns in static and called it contact because silence was unbearable. Cold War analysts saw unidentified radar blips and called them threats because ignorance was worse than invasion. Duncan Lunan found mathematical beauty in delayed echoes and called it a message because randomness felt too cruel. And when a thermal blanket tumbled through space in 1998, millions of people looked at a photograph and saw ancient technology because the alternative, that we're screaming into an empty universe, was too horrifying to accept. We've been listening to the cosmos for over a century now. We've aimed radio telescopes at distant stars, broadcast messages toward potentially habitable worlds, scanned millions of frequencies for any whisper of intelligence, and the universe has answered us with perfect, absolute silence. Not hostile, not welcoming, just empty. And human beings were never designed to tolerate that kind of emptiness. We're pattern-seeking creatures. We find faces in clouds, conspiracies in coincidences, and intention in accidents. It's how we survived as a species, by assuming every rustling bush contained a predator, every strange sound signaled danger, every pattern meant something. But what happens when the pattern leads nowhere? What happens when the greatest mystery of human existence, are we alone, refuses to resolve itself? We invent resolution. We create watchers in orbit, ancient probes, 13,000-year-old messages. We need to believe something has been observing us, studying us, waiting for us to evolve sufficiently to make contact, because that narrative, however unsettling, is infinitely preferable to the truth that we might be the universe's only audience, shouting into darkness that will never answer back. The Black Knight satellite survives every debunking, every rational explanation, every piece of contradictory evidence, because it was never about facts, it was about fear. Not fear of alien contact, fear of the opposite. Fear that we're cosmically insignificant. Fear that consciousness is a rare accident. Fear that when we finally die out, the universe won't notice or care. So we keep the story alive. We recirculate the 1998 photograph. We reference Tesla's mysterious signals. We point to Lunan's star map. We collect fragments of unrelated events separated by decades and centuries and weave them into a narrative that suggests purpose, observation, ancient intelligence. We build mythology from coincidence because mythology offers what reality cannot: meaning. Perhaps that's the real mystery the Black Knight satellite reveals. Not what's watching us from orbit, but what we're so desperately afraid to face about ourselves. If something truly had been observing humanity for 13,000 years, would it have announced itself by now? Would it have made contact, revealed its purpose, answered our questions? Or would it simply continue watching, knowing that we'd eventually tell ourselves whatever story we needed to hear? And if the universe has been silent all along, what does it say about us that we refuse to believe it? If stories like this make you question what we've been told, subscribe to Dark Dimensions X and hit the bell, because some mysteries don't end when the video does. They follow you into the silence.